Okay, hello everybody. I'm back with another video today, and I am going to talk about the questions that I got. I'm not going to address every single question from everybody because obviously there was a lot of overlap, sometimes in the classes, but also between my classes. Um, but I am going to address a lot of the concerns that people had about this paper. So if I don't address your concern meaningfully, if I skipped it or you need more clarity, feel free to talk to me. I will say that I got a lot of questions about whether or not we would conference, and I don't make conferences mandatory for this unit. If you look at the schedule regularly, it doesn't have conferences on it for Unit 3. At this point in the semester, given how there are a lot of projects coming up for students and schedules can be rather hectic, I don't mandate conferences per se, because I know that there's a lot of work that other people are, or that you're doing on for other people, I should say. Um, so I don't make it mandatory. If you think my feedback was useful in the past, you were more than welcome to have a conference with me, and that's what's been happening. In fact, people have gotten in touch with me wanting to talk about their paper. Um, so another thing I should mention, which might have mentioned earlier, but I'll do for the sake of redundancy, this paper will be due on the 24th of April, as opposed to, I believe, the 17th, which I talked about originally. And so just keep that in mind. You have like time to ask more questions. That's fine. But hopefully, a lot of the questions should be answered here. Also, I'll be offering feedback too, like starting well, I've already started on the stuff, so I should be finishing that up sometime over the weekend. On your that is feedback on your Unit 3 rough drafts. All right, so here we are getting into the big Unit 3 questions. We're going to start with questions about tailoring the argument, or I've tried to put these into different categories. Some of them might be a little bit more clear than others, but I think overall you should get a sense of what we're talking about with that particular heading, let's say. So, do I spend time arguing over what my stakeholders are arguing over, or do I act like I'm writing an argumentative essay that would happen to strike the interest of my stakeholder? How direct should I be? So for me, you should be incredibly direct with this. You're addressing them, which is a very direct thing. And I suggest looking back at the samples for more clarity there, because they both do that. They both address the stakeholder specifically. So if you don't make a persuasive argument that addresses the stakeholder, um, then you're not really doing the assignment, I would say. Making a persuasive argument, however, that doesn't address the stakeholder while still being tailored to them is possible, but it's not really what we're looking for. So that kind of goes along with this kind of perspective here. You want to be direct, in other words, and I'll be very clear about that for you. So be direct. So how can I set an argument without arguing on my behalf more than the people affected? Um, so I think you should keep the people affected in mind, but if you count yourself in that group, then that's totally fine. And moreover, I don't see how you can argue on your behalf without being impacted by the issue in some way. So I think that these distinctions aren't as clear as you're making them out to be with this question, which is a good thing because it means that you can talk about yourself possibly in terms of the people affected by this. Obviously, if you are, I think you should. So think about that. If the issue doesn't affect you, um, well, I would say that most issues can affect everybody at a certain level, but you could try and avoid talking about yourself, I would say, if you're really 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 feeling that way. Yeah. So, if my stakeholder does not agree with the argument of the facts, starting by addressing the facts and trying to convince them, should I also talk about what the stakeholder can do to eradicate the issue or minimize its discussion? So, this is a stasis question. It's not unusual for people in the course of argument to talk about all of its aspects. If you want to mention a policy, that would be fine, but the key word there is mention. It should not be the bulk of the paper or be the emphasis by the end of the, if the problem lies somewhere else, because the purpose of the paper is to resolve that status issue. You need to tailor your argument. It needs to be more specific. Throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, that's not tailoring things. That's not using that specific point of intervention that you found in the first paper. So that means that it's okay to mention these things, but it should be weighted towards that other, like that primary form of argument that you're making. So that's something to keep in mind. Am I arguing one side of the issue? You're arguing for a specific thing here. If you don't argue for something specific or for different conflicting things, then that's not the assignment. If you're not arguing for anything, then that's also not the assignment. This is you trying to get something done. And I don't know why you would be arguing also for not your position or the position contrary to your own. Yeah, so it might help to look at the prompt again to see what the assignment requires. I think that would help a little bit with question, or if you're feeling doubts about what you're supposed to do here, in that regard, because I think the prompt like very pointedly talks about what you need to do here in terms of the kinds of evidence and what you're going to need to do in this assignment. So, the most important question about this assignment is how to structure the essay and how many reasons I should put in my essay, having a hard time to apply the rhetorical analysis and stasis theory for each reason. I would say you don't need to talk about stasis theory at all in the paper if you don't want to, and I want to see you ask your stakeholder something and then back up your request via reasoning in the form of evidence, the likes of which they would be most receptive toward. You don't need to do like big analysis on your evidence per se. You should do some explaining, but you should be explaining it for the sake of explaining it to your stakeholder, not to like analyze it for stasis stuff because I'm reading it, for instance. I'm interested in you seeing, or in seeing you craft an effective argument towards your stakeholder here. That's the most important part of this assignment. The question I have is, how do I write this essay without regurgitating everything from previous essays? This is a common question, and I saw it probably like 12 or 13 times among my classes, so among my like 70-odd students. So the thing is that this project is, it should come from more work, obviously. If you're writing the same paper that you wrote for Unit 2 and Unit 1, then you didn't do Unit 2 and Unit 1 correctly, because this assignment is a persuasive paper, whereas the other two were not. And that changes so much about what the tone of your paper is going to be. It changes the evidence that you need to be talking about. You don't need to examine every single perspective about the issue, for instance, like you had to do in Unit 2, like you had to like gesture at in Unit 1. You just need to tailor your argument to your stakeholder. If you're not using additional sources and you're just using the sources that you used in Unit 2, I guarantee you that your stakeholder is probably going to dismiss like some of those sources that you try to use. So please be aware of that. I'm going to be looking and making sure that you're tailoring your argument to your stakeholder. But most important question I have involves stasis theory. If I'm trying to convince my stakeholder strictly of fact, is it okay to use those other parts as long as I focus mainly on fact? Yep, I've kind of addressed this like previously, but just make sure to emphasize that particular aspect. If you want to address all of them with an equal emphasis, then that's when it becomes an issue. My most important question is, how do I think of multiple solutions, or think of multiple solutions in place to solve the problem with my stakeholder's argument? I want to give multiple options to effectively persuade them to change their way of thinking. So this can be a common issue. What I would say is that you should limit your scope. You should find some particular solutions, or like just one. Um, so think about it for a second, and this is, me making that, putting together a hypothetical scenario. If you're hostile to a position that somebody has, are you more willing to listen to them if you're only asking for one thing or a bunch of things? And I said a billion there, but that's an overstatement. The more you can narrow down exactly what you want from a stakeholder, the more likely you are to get what you want, and ideally what they want, perhaps. Um, Again, this isn't throwing a bunch of spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. It is you developing if for instance you have a policy, it says solutions here. Um, if you have a policy, you can write a whole lot about one single policy. I know this to be the case. If you want to write about a bunch of different ones, then that shows that there's not a lot of energy or effort being put into doing research and like justification for like any one of them, let's say. You might have a source for each of those, but it's not really, or that's not very robust. And what if your stakeholder doesn't like any of those policies? It's better to like put all of your energy into that one specific thing and really defending it well against counter arguments. So that's what I would have to say there. So for me, the most important question in this assignment is how to propose a middle ground between my position and my stakeholders. In other words, if a stakeholder's argument is A, mine is A plus B, believe me, it does make a difference. So I would say that for the strategy here, you need to think about your position and try to find a solution that solves most of what you both want. Obviously, there are positions when you might not want to, or where you might want to take a hard line, though. Sometimes the middle ground can be illusory, but it also might not be, of course. I think you should think about what kind of way of thinking would get them on board with you, and working through that to find a solution to your issue. Something I should also address with this question is that you can run into the issue if this argument comes out of the line of thinking that the middle ground is the best option because it is between two positions. For further reading, I would say you need to research the middle ground fallacy or argument of moderation, as it is called. That doesn't necessarily mean the position is automatically bad, it's just that it comes from flawed logic. And now we move on to evidence. So, how do I find more evidence to argue the importance of my issue since it's not really a current issue? I would say it's probably more current than you think. I wouldn't have let you like do this topic if it wasn't. So even since like the rant for Unit 1, it has to be an issue that is ongoing that you would like to see changed. So if you're feeling that that doesn't really describe your topic anymore, I would say you need to think about what aspects of your issue are still important today, and then proceeding from what you find there, by doing research about those aspects still. It might be the case that you need to broaden out your understanding of the issue as opposed to making it like incredibly particular. All right, how to do additional research? Ugh. Because I feel like I've maxed out in a way on all of the things I can say to and about my stakeholder. So for me, I'd be shocked if that was the case. But it's entirely possible that you found other stuff, like in your earlier papers, that would be effective. But you need to supply similar evidence to that. Like you should be finding additional sources that also go along with those perspectives if you want to like make them really convincing to your stakeholder. In doing that, that's me seeing you tailor it to your stakeholder. What is not tailoring it to your stakeholder is just simply reusing those sources again, without offering additional ones on top of that, ones that go along with those sources. So that's something to keep in mind. How do I show realistic stats and evidence to prove my argument is valid and or possible if it has never been proven or done in the past? I don't like the word proven, because what if the stakeholder says no, it's not proven, and that's possible. So what constitutes proof changes depending on the person, in other words. Obviously, your argument should have a logic to them. It should make sense what we're reading and why. But at the same time, this isn't a logic class. So I'm simply interested in you making the attempt to tailor things to your stakeholder. You seem to prefer logos based upon some of the language you use above. But what if your stakeholder disputes it? You're going to need to do more than that. The last part of the sentence is a little confusing because to me it's okay if something hasn't been proven or done in the past. There are a great many things that weren't or that were done for the first time at some point. Just because someone hasn't done something before doesn't mean it shouldn't be done, in other words. So here are a couple other ones. How many citations do we need from this essay? Well, at least 2. A mix of primary and secondary sources, I think, is the language used in the prompt. And are there certain types, like academic or non-academic? No, it all depends on your stakeholder. Moving on to tone and rhetorical strategy. My biggest question is how to sound less opinionated and more objective in my essay. I care a lot about what I'm writing about, and I'm not sure how much I should let that in the essay. For me, it's okay if you you should probably talk about how much you care about something and why in your essay. I think that can be important. Maybe depending on who the stakeholder is. Maybe they also innately don't care about something like that. But I would say for the most part, people do. So it's a big part of this paper to have the tone be appropriate to the stakeholder. It may be the case that you hate your stakeholder's guts, for instance, but I would say that for most of the projects I've seen, it is possible for us to get at least a glimpse of the motivations behind possibly even the worst decisions. I think if you approach with the idea that these positions that people have are not frivolous, that is to say, they didn't just make them up on the spot, and that they come from a lot of their experiences and maybe what they've been taught over the years, the things that they've learned, it's hard for me at least to not be a little understanding of that position because I was also taught things. I also had experiences. I know what that's like. Those really clearly form who you are and the positions that you have. And so to see that in somebody else, that's a pretty good way of going about it. It's okay if you disagree with them still, like very, very vehemently. And it's okay if you call a spade and say that something is dangerous or something like that. But I would say that you need to, by and large, be aware of your tone. Something that you want to remember is that you want something from them. So always return to that idea, like put that in your head. Approaching from that perspective can be valuable. Don't undermine your purpose with this paper, in other words. Think about the fact that you definitely want something from them. How are you going to get that? You aren't going to get it just by yelling at them and scolding them, in other words. How do I connect actual sources and personal experiences to persuade my stakeholder without losing credibility? So to my mind, you don't lose credibility for using personal experiences or other like sources with most, if not all, stakeholders. That's still evidence. If you're using it to further your goal, I don't know why you're including or if you don't know why you're including certain evidence in your paper, then it probably shouldn't be there, because you're probably just using it at that point and not thinking about what the stakeholder would think about it or how it can contribute to your position. So you shouldn't be just throwing evidence in there for no reason. It needs to be furthering your point in some way. What tone would you use in this assignment? I don't know if informal is acceptable, as I think it depends on the certain types of stakeholders. I think that's correct. It totally depends on how you feel about the stakeholders. An informal tone is okay, but so is a formal one. And that's really as basic as I can make that. I can't be more particular about it without talking about the specific stakeholders. It should always emerge from like how you relate to your stakeholder, let's say. Any tips on how to recognize if you're being too mean or accusing? So for me, when I write, I take check-ins and reread sections. I ask myself, am I being too pointed here? Does it feel like this language is putting my stakeholder on the spot? How would I feel if I was in their shoes and someone came at me like this? Would I want this smoke? These are all good questions that will try to get you to occupy that position and let you see the points where you might need to leaven your argument a little bit. It's also a good thing, again, to remember your purpose for the argument. As I've said before, don't lose the fact that you're doing this because you want something. And also, that doesn't mean you should be over-flattering either. That's another issue, because people can also see through that. Any tips on how to recognize if you're being too mean or accusing? Blah, 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 blah. Oh, wait, I copied and pasted this. Damn it. The most important question I have for this paper would have to be whether or not it's okay to get personal with the stakeholder I'm arguing to. In my draft, I've used the words you and I a couple times to persuade the stakeholder, but I do not know if that's okay. And yes, it is okay. I got a lot of questions like this, as a matter of fact. Do it, or don't do it if you don't feel like it. That's all I have to say about that. But it should be addressed to them in some way, either in terms of like the quality or the evidence, or like very rigidly structurally up to like writing them a letter, let's say. An important question I have is, how much arguing should I be doing in the paper? Does every argument have to contain new arguments against my stakeholder? I would say a lot of arguing, and yes, but I would say what I mean by arguments here is like new forms of evidence. Ideally, you should have a lot of evidence to back up your stakeholder. You shouldn't be making, let's say, entirely different arguments with entirely different purposes throughout the paper. It should be, you should be, all of the paragraphs should be working together towards a specific goal, let's say. So make sure that that's something that's still happening. The most important question about this assignment is, should we dedicate a whole section of the paper to explaining the stakeholder's opinion, or can we just reference it when we suggest something that differs from their opinion? I would say it would be best to weave it throughout the paper, but it would also be fine to have its own brief section, say towards the beginning, but it should be brief. Spending a lot of time explaining someone's own argument back to them leaves little room to talk about the good stuff, which is the argument that you're making. I want to see that more so than what they're saying, but I do want to know what their position is about the matter. I want to see you having a conversation with them, basically. What's the most effective way to structure my essay? That's a really big question. It depends, and that's really all I can say about that. It depends on your stakeholder, your purpose, your tone, your evidence. So many factors have the possibility to change that, and also many different kinds of structure can potentially work for every given paper. There's not a lot of useful evidence or like useful advice I could give there. It's not my job to tell you what the most effective way to structure your essay is. It's your job to figure out through your own feelings and through the research that you've done, through how well you know your stakeholder. It's your job to put together your own structure there. And it should be a coherent structure. But like I've been saying all along, there's not a particular structure that is described to this paper. It all should emerge for you from what your research is telling you, from your understanding of the topic and the stakeholder. The most important question I have is how to expand more on my argument. I feel like I really pinpointed the major points of the argument and my stance. Is it worth mentioning the smaller aspects that are not as important? So I think it's hard to write too much for when it comes to this paper. If you've covered your argument and stance, though, then you should also cover their stance and potential counter arguments that they might be making towards you. With those two large sections of writing, i.e., your major points of argument, and then also like covering their perspective and counter arguments, then that's all you need in the entire paper, more or less. And if you go back to the sample papers, it was more or less doing that, especially the second one. The biggest question I have is how to pose this essay in a way that is actually a sound argument. I feel like I'm repetitive and most of my points aren't very good. I can't tell if I'm setting up my essay correctly. What I would say is that, well, I don't know what you mean by a sound argument necessarily. You should simply be making an argument that is made with premises and sub-premises that are used to support it. With appropriate evidence, you will have a sound argument. And sometimes you might sound repetitive, but it's also important to be redundant sometimes. That can be a deliberate choice. The only time that repetition is an issue is when you're using the same vocabulary and evidence over and over in the same way multiple times. Find other ways to use that evidence, or find more evidence to talk about, more importantly. So the most important question I have is about how am I going to format my body paragraph so that it sounds like a persuasive essay. So persuasiveness doesn't come from any particular kind of structure. I think both of the samples that we looked at show different ways of approaching the assignment in terms of structure to pretty good success. It emerges from the way you relate your premises and your evidence to your stakeholder. And structure can be a part of that, but it's not inherent in it. While the flow and the order of how your elements appear matters, the idea of persuasiveness more so comes, for me at least, from those rhetorical strategies and things like word choice, etc. Regarding ethos, pathos, and logos now. Should I combine these throughout my essay instead of making them into separate paragraphs? I would say yes, or not. It depends on how you're feeling. Whatever seems more natural to you is the way you should go here. I've seen both kinds of applications that you're describing. So there might be a paragraph that more it caters towards the stakeholders' emotions. There might be a paragraph that talks more about like studies that have been done, and there might be a paragraph about a significant person relating to the issue that is really poignant. So like a quote from a significant person, in other words. I've seen all of those things, but I've also seen these rhetorical strategies weaved throughout the paper. So it totally depends on how like you want to tackle this. How do I use pathos to make my argument when the stakeholder is very logos-based? And how can I be persuasive without relying entirely on logos and incorporating different types of appeals like pathos? How can I still appeal to emotion but seem credible? So this is, well, these are just like two example questions that I got, but it's a perspective that's pretty common. For me, my perspective on the rhetorical proofs is that it is emotion that allows the logos to have the context. So what I mean, where this is coming from, my position is that you kind of need all of these things. You need ethos, pathos, and logos in a paper to have an effective argument. Or you need, not just in a paper, in any kind of argument, let's say. So you can weave pathos and logos together by way of explaining how the statistics you're mentioning matter. The example I gave in class, I believe at one point, was of sea levels rising such an amount over a year. Someone might say, who cares, or that's not that much, but then you would employ pathos and pay special attention to describing in great detail, like the consequences of such a thing, or incorporate narratives about situations that have already happened where the fact or stat that you're mentioning is super important. Those are things that you can do to incorporate the pathos there. You need to be telling us why that stuff is significant. And I think that pathos really allows that context to come through. It really provides a lot when taken in tandem with logos. So that's something that you can do. That's what I would suggest. Regarding concessions and counterarguments, this section is rather brief, and so are the next few. We're coming down to the wire. My most important question is if I should mention one of the counterarguments to my argument. Would it benefit my paper to address them to show I know it can be an issue and I'm not ignoring it, or would it end up hurting my paper instead? So this is a requirement for the paper, actually. You need to address like a counterargument at least one that they could make towards your own argument. But you need to follow up that counter argument also with some commentary about like some aspect of it, like why it's not actually the case. Or you could say, you might be thinking this, but I am talking about this, and this specifically. Yes, you're correct. That might not be like part of my solution. For instance, if I was making a policy, might not be applicable in this certain scenario, and that's understandable. But for these other scenarios, it's very effective and worthwhile. So doing something like that, trying to foresee what they're going to say to you, and then thinking about what you might say back to them. That is how I want to see you incorporating counter arguments in your paper. Technical stuff. Can we exceed the word count? Yes. Is the essay supposed to be presenting an argument to a stakeholder, or our stakeholder's argument to another stakeholder? It's supposed to be yours to them. I would say look back at the prompt if you're confused about this still at all, and if you have any, like, this is a pretty big thing. If you I would say reread the prompt. Everybody should reread the prompt at a certain point as they're working on their paper, to make sure that you've got the idea of the assignment down, because this would be very, very, very off in terms of the assignment. You need to be making an argument to your stakeholder, period. Anything other than that, anything outside of that, that's not what this assignment wants. And I'm going to be looking for it and grading accordingly based on that. So this, like, it should be fairly clear if you're engaging with the material from the class that I've been making. If you're engaging with the prompt, then it should be fairly clear what you're supposed to be doing. Alright, here's a question that I didn't necessarily know where to put anywhere else, but that doesn't mean it's like bad or something like that. It just means that it's talking about the nature of the assignment itself. So my main question is, when going into this essay, how can I make this project of making an argumentative essay different than the past essays I wrote in high school? In what way can I make this paper have more depth and meaning? So I think about this a lot as I'm teaching, what students might have experienced before in terms of their high school classes. Everybody's experiences were wildly different. I guarantee you that's 100% the case. I would stake all of my life on it, in fact. But sometimes I see people for this assignment trying to go back to using the 5-paragraph persuasive essay just because it has the word persuasive in it, basically. And that's not what you want to do here. The paper's way too long for that, again. I think insofar as this is for a college comp course, it'll be more sophisticated. The amount of research that you've had to do so far, like, consider units 1 and 2 preliminary research for this paper. You've been preparing your whole semester for this paper. I want you to keep that in mind. So with that amount of research, I think that's different automatically than anything you had to do for high school. The amount of time and energy you've spent on this is wildly different. And also the amount of nuance you're going to need to add to your papers too. I think that the idea of concessions and counter arguments is probably different, or like that's an added wrinkle beyond just like trying to make a persuasive essay by using a lot of logos evidence and trying to win an argument. We're not trying to win a logic argument for the sake of an assignment grade here. We're trying to change lives. So I think the way that lesson or that purpose permeates the paper really changes things, I would say. And if you learned all of this stuff in high school already, that's really awesome. I don't mean that flippantly either. it sounds like a really good high school, to be honest. All right. So those were the questions that I had, like the big questions. Otherwise, uh, there were a lot of questions about whether or not we were having conferences or questions about how peer review worked. But I think a lot of people either figured that out or contacted me in terms of if they had trouble. And I will say that if you did not get peer review for this assignment, I'm still going to be leaving you feedback, and so I'm working on that right now. I had to stop in order to do this video, but I'm giving you feedback on your Unit 3 drafts. We can conference if you would like, but otherwise, I would say that I'm confident in your abilities to really tackle this paper, especially now, hopefully, that I now that I've done some Q&A with you, let's say. So I'm going to be putting this slideshow on Canvas as well. It'll be popped up in or the link will be in the same discussion post. On Friday, actually on Thursday, so it's probably Thursday now because I'm recording this at like 12 in the morning. But I'm going to be putting up later today an audio lecture that I did with my colleague talking about Unit 4. On Friday, I will be talking about an assignment that I would like for us to do, and that'll be due sometime in the middle of next week. So, yeah, I can't think of anything else to talk about, so I'm ending it right here. Thank you.